Glad to see everybody's back today. All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Again, if you just got in here, there's two things. We have you to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, where you're from. A lot of us have been, doing this since day one. All right, so I love to see you all on Saturday mornings. Other people may be new, so please put your name and where you're coming from in the chat. And then also, our question for this for today is, what have you learned from this Black History Month? The Center for K-12 Black History and Racial Literacy Education welcomes you, and we hope that you had a wonderful Black History Month, reading Black History, learning Black History, researching Black History, writing Black History, teaching, and loving Black History. So for myself, LeGarrette King, Donovan James, Greg Simmons, and Montana, we really appreciate you all for joining us for these Black History Nerds sessions here. All right, just a reminder, people, proposals are still open for the Teaching Black History Conference. This year's theme is The Sounds of Blackness, Hip Hop Turns 50. We have a wonderful, conference planned for you all. Registration is coming very soon. Trust me, it's coming very soon. We have to get the official word from the University of Buffalo. All right, they take a little bit long time for those approvals, but registration is opening up very soon. But if you are interested in presenting at the Teaching Black History Conference, your topic does not have to be about hip hop education. It could be about any topic around Black history, right? So if you have a really good idea, you like to share your thoughts and learn with and learn from hundreds of Black history educators from around the world, please submit your proposals. We'll, through our website, we'll have that link distributed in the chat. So our resources of the week, myself, Brianne Pitts, and Donovan James, we co-edited a special edition of the Social Studies in the Young Learner, Black History in the Elementary Classrooms. We'll put that link in the chat. There are a few free access articles from the journal, and then other than that, to access other articles, you would have to be a NCSS member to get those. But if you would like an article, you can email myself or Donovan, about any PDFs that you may want. Also, a new book by Michael Hines is out, A Worthy Piece of Work, the untold story of Madeline Morgan and the fight for Black history in schools. If you're interested in the history of Black history, this is an excellent book that talks about a Chicago educator, right, where I believe after World War II, set to develop one of the first Black history K-12 Black history curriculum in Chicago, right? So really good book. It tells you about the context of all these particular pieces, and we'll leave a link in the chat for those who are interested in that piece book, which is an excellent piece. I think it goes very well with Given's fugitive pedagogy, and also with Aaron Snyder's Making Black History. So if you're real interested in the history of Black history, then we definitely would advise you to get those particular pieces for your resources to read. And we'll put those links in the chat. The next week, March 4th, next Saturday, we have Dr. Ashley Farmer coming in with social justice and historical context. She will talk about kind of the the various different misconceptions we have about civil rights histories. And so we're real excited to have Dr. Ashley Foreman from the University of Texas at Austin. And here's her book, Remaking Black Power, about all the Black women who contributed to the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Very good book as well. But that's next week, so make sure you register, people. All right, y'all didn't come here to hear me today. You came here to learn about the concepts of oral histories, and I would definitely pass this over to Dr. Arcasia James-Gallaway.
All right. You can hear me? Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Thank y'all for being here. I know we come from different time zones, but regardless, everywhere just about, and on the US side of things, it's before noon and it's Saturday. So much appreciated for giving me some of your time this morning. We have a lot to get through. I'm trying not to be too ambitious. Oral history, you could teach courses on it for years. But this is kind of a quick and dirty intro into it, obviously with the focus on Black folks. So let's get into it. I'm gonna describe or kind of introduce myself as part of the presentation so you kind of know who I am and how I come to this work. So give me 1 second, let me screen share and we can get rolling. All right, so what you heard about Black history, teaching with oral histories of Black America. And as a note, just related to ability status and ableism, what you heard from the African American community, when we ask what you heard, we're not necessarily requiring the person to be listening, to be able to hear. What we're asking is, what have people been talking about? What have you been hearing, right? And that, again, doesn't require one to hear. So when we ask, or when I ask what you heard, it's kind of like, what do you know? What do you know about this topic? What don't you know, and what are you interested in knowing? And so that's kind of what we're going to be exploring together today. So again, I'm being sort of ambitious, but we have about 5 parts of the talk today. So first, I'll introduce myself, and we're gonna talk through some basic definitions of how we come at oral history when we think about it from a Black perspective, because that's what my work does, that's what I'm interested in. And that's presumably why we're at Black History Nerds this morning. So we'll talk through that. And then we'll talk through, I'm going to highlight a few specific oral history collections that I find to be really useful, obviously for K-12 educators specifically, that can be included in classroom practice, that are available digitally for folks to use in their classroom with their students. Then I'm going to highlight a few classroom activity suggestions. These are just some starting points that teachers, K-12 teachers, could use to start to integrate oral histories, whether it's original collection of oral histories or engaging with the transcripts and the recordings themselves as available online. Then we'll get into some sort of key considerations about trying to engage oral history with students, just stuff we need to be thinking through from the educator perspective in terms of being prepared, in terms of equipment, in terms of stuff like release forms, just things we may not think about because oral history is a particular way of trying to understand the past. And then I'm going to highlight a couple implementation resources for folks who are interested and willing to kind of shift their pedagogy or include some oral history in their instruction. So, oh no, I skipped a slide. No, I didn't, sorry. So what is oral history? What is oral history? So I'm gonna show a really quick video that gives a very quick introduction into what I mean when we think about oral history from a Black perspective. So let me get reshared here 1 second. And this is one of the resources actually that I'm going to highlight later on in the talk, but this gives us a quick and dirty understanding of what we mean when we talk about oral history.
I was in love with Tyrone, My relationship was heating up. And my parents knew that, so they had to take charge. Mother told me we would be spending the summer in the South. And that's where I was going to be introduced to my great-grandmother, Sylvia. She was 106 years old. And I just did not want to be spending my time with a senile old woman. But 4 days later, we were in Farmerville, Louisiana. Driving on this old road, I saw this log cabin, and I noticed on the front porch, that was her. She had a slender, almost frail frame, but I still found her to be regal looking. And at night, she would tell her stories. When the Civil War ended, she was my age. She was 16. She said, even though she had freedom, not knowing how to read and write made her feel like a jigsaw puzzle with some of the pieces missing. And when she was 85 years old, she said, it stops here. She got help from grown-ups, and sometimes from children, and she would study on her own. And then she told me that she had something special to show me. She went to a cedar chest at the foot of her bed and she opened it up. And when I saw what it was, I was wondering, why is she bringing me this old tattered church fan? But when she turned it over, scrawled on the back of that fan, she had printed Sylvia. She told me that when she could spell her name, that was when she got her freedom. She passed in 1965, but Grandma Sylvia is living on in my heart.
Okay, so that again is a really quick sort of introduction into what I mean when I talk about oral history, because again, I'm exclusively interested in sort of the way that Black people see things. Give me a second. Let me reshare my slideshow here. And I really appreciate that particular clip from StoryCorps, which again, I'll highlight a little later, because it does a lot of really exciting things. It talks about history from a Black woman's perspective, or a couple of Black women. You see embedded in that clip a couple different oral histories. You get the oral history from the person whose voice we're hearing, the narrator, what oral historians call the folks that they interview, but also through that recording, we're able to hear about the narrator's grandmother, Sylvia. And so many pieces of history, of Black history, are highlighted in that piece. The inaccess to formal education, the significance of, the Civil War, the South, like going to Louisiana, but even, getting caught up in a summer romance as a teenager. Like, there are so many exciting pieces of Black life, like embedded in that clip. And so when we think about what we mean specifically by oral history, that point about recording the history, right? Because many of us, many folks familiar with the African-American tradition have often heard stories, right? I'm sure that's probably not exclusive to Black people, but that's the perspective, that's the experience that I come from. So that's from where I can speak. We hear stories all the time, but oral history is the intentional recording of such stories, right? That allows us to be able to go back and access those stories once people may have transitioned or passed on. So the University of California, Berkeley's Oral History Center describes oral history as we see, the recording and interpretation of facts of a person's memories, their life experiences, identity, expertise. Basically, we're trying to get to how they understand the world. And so what's really important to know about oral history is that we're not concerned with how correct, how accurate somebody's memory is, okay? We have other ways of sort of understanding that. What oral history is most concerned with is how people remember the past. How does, in this case, how do Black people remember what has happened to them in the past? And even if those facts don't specifically or clearly line up with what maybe the written record has written down, that's okay, because oral history, again, is remembering, is trying to really come to terms with, as it says here, if historical evidence can tell you something about what one person or groups of people, or even groups of people, thought was important enough to remember and recount in a certain way. And so I think about oral history, particularly in my work in academia, we think about it as what Toni Morrison would describe as discredited knowledge. And she talks about that as her way of sort of how she was in conversation with the ancestors when she was writing many of her novels, Beloved in particular. And she talks about discredited knowledge that as her way of communing and the ancestors talking to her after they've passed on, and that being discredited because it's deemed as superstitious, it's deemed as something that's not real. And what she says is, and I love this because she loves to get people together in interviews. I'm sure many of y'all have seen Toni Morrison gather folks in interviews. And she wrote about this in a book chapter from like 1980, 84, I believe. But she talks about the knowledge, much of the knowledge that Black people produce, particularly when we produce it in forms that are different than traditional written documents, as being discredited because we as Black people are discredited. Therefore, anything we produce is assumed, not real knowledge, right? And so oral history, particularly when you're thinking about quote unquote real history, stuff that's been written down already, is discredited because it comes from an African-American perspective. But what we want to remember also when we're doing oral history, one of the primary goals, and something that a lot of people sort of overlook or just don't do, is to make sure that it's whatever you record is accessible to the community broadly, but specifically the community from which it comes. So this can look like creating your own website and making sure it's available to the public, or sometimes donating them to existing archives or digital repositories where folks, anybody can go to access these oral histories. But that point of community accessibility is something that we don't want to overlook. So me and my work, as I've hinted at, oral history is central to my scholarship, how I think about the past, how I think about Black people's past. And so generally, I describe myself in academic settings as an interdisciplinary historian of education. And I use the term interdisciplinary intentionally, in part because my work sits in both education as an applied field and history, which is more so of like an academic discipline in many cases. But also, I'm interdisciplinary because I study Black people primarily. And anybody who studies Black people, it can't just sit in one area of study or thinking. Black people do everything. We're everywhere. And so if we really want to fully capture Black life and do so with justice, we have to use tools from all different areas: sociology, anthropology, political science, you name it, right? Black people have been there, we've done it, and we need some of those tools to be able to effectively represent Black life in whatever capacity, whether it's in the classroom as an educator or as a writer, researcher, what have you. And so oral history is really, like I said, central to everything that I do and I think about in my research, mainly because the questions that I'm trying to answer in my work aren't written down. The answers have not been recorded. Right. And so if I were to limit my work as a historian to what written documents have said about Black people and their experiences, I would have nothing to say. I wouldn't have a book project. Like there wouldn't be anything to represent Black life. So the specific example in my current book project, I'm really interested in and looking at school desegregation from the experience of Black students. But I'm specifically trying to understand how did gender and class status shape the experiences of Black students who were involuntarily forced to desegregate. And because I'm interested specifically in Black students' perspectives, my investigation of school board minutes, of newspaper articles, aren't written from a Black perspective. Nobody gave Black students a pen or a typewriter at that point in history and asked them to represent what was happening. And so in order to answer this question about how gender, race, and class shape Black students' experiences, I had to go talk to elders. There was no other way for me to do my work. And so that's one of the ways that I've engaged original oral history interviews by conducting my own. But some of the resources that I'm going to share, we all have access to. If you have access to the internet, we have access to existing interviews. And these are really important because many of these folks have passed on, right? They've transitioned, they're their ancestors. And so being able to access and engage with these existing interviews has been important for my work. A recent project that I did, I looked at the experiences of the first 2 Black school board members in Waco, because I'm from Waco and that's the primary site of my research. And so being able to go back to these oral history interviews that they sat for filled in so many holes in the project that I was trying to do. So again, that information and that insight wasn't recorded, it wasn't written down anywhere else but for those oral history interviews. So yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions about me and my work, but that's sort of my orientation, and that's why I know that oral history is really essential to Black history. Why is oral history fundamental to Black history? So as I've hinted at before, written records only tell partial stories, okay? Even if written records are in some cases authored by African Americans, if we think really critically about class level and access to the infrastructure necessary to record Black history, an example from my work, the Waco Messenger was the only Black-owned newspaper in Waco, with the exception of the newspaper produced by Paul Quinn, which was an HBCU. It used to be in Waco and now it's in Dallas. And I got, a fellowship to go and investigate this newspaper, the Waco Messenger. I'm all excited. I'm like, yeah, they're going to talk about Black students and DSEG and this. And I go and I'm so disappointed because nothing about desegregation or K-12 desegregation was in those newspapers. And 2, with a little bit more digging, I found out that the people who ran the newspaper were part of the Black middle class in Waco, and they gave very little attention to working class, like what I call ordinary people, more ordinary people. They gave very little attention to some of the stuff that I was really interested in learning about. So again, regardless of the perspective from which written records are written, they're only going to tell a partial story. So in some cases, though, when they are often written from a Eurocentric or white perspective, many experiences, Black experiences, are either erased, they're missing, or they're distorted in a really warped way. So again, that can tell us maybe what white people were doing or thinking about a particular topic, which is useful information, right? Especially when we think about counter narratives, what the mainstream narrative is and how oral histories can sort of challenge that. And that's information that we want to include, especially when we're trying to contextualize the importance of including oral history in a particular project. But we always want to be we want to be skeptical. We want to encourage we want to be skeptical as educators, and we want to encourage our students to have that same skepticism anytime they're presented with any type of information. And then, as noted in the video about Sylvia, the grandmother Sylvia, access to formal education for Black people was illegal in most places where Black people were in this country for hundreds of years, the majority of this country's history. And so that has a direct effect on how many written records are able to accurately represent the Black experience. So again, these are reasons that oral histories are absolutely fundamental to Black history. And so when we think about oral history and how it is related to traditional primary sources, and by that I generally mean written sources, because when we think about history, we often think about things that have been written down already. We want to understand that we're not trying to compete. Oral histories are not meant to compete with primary sources, with written documents. That's not their intention. They're intended to give a fuller account, a more accurate, I won't say accurate, a fuller, more comprehensive, more complex image of what happened in the past. Okay, so it's not like, oh, well, this says this and this says this, so this is more correct. No, remember, in oral history, we're not interested in the facts of history, quote unquote, this happened on this day in this place, this way. We're interested in how people were remembering whatever the event or occasion was. And so when we bring together both traditional written records and oral histories, we have a much richer way of understanding not just what happened in the past, but what those experiences meant to the people who went through them. And then again, this just intends to provide a more complete and fuller picture of the past. The more sources that we can draw on to understand what people went through, the more critical and more accurate our understanding of the past is. And so when we think about oral history for K-12 educators specifically, honestly, I haven't seen, as a K-12 educator in, before I became like a researcher and a scholar and academic, I didn't know about oral history, right? I didn't know about it. And so I didn't have access, to information like this to be able to incorporate it into my pedagogy, into my classroom. But I think it's a really powerful tool, especially when we're trying to work with students on developing a more critical understanding of the past and the way that history doesn't just exist, it's created, it's crafted. There are intentional ways that people go about pulling on evidence to reconstruct what happened in the past and what it meant to people. And doing that work gives students hands-on experience with non-traditional primary sources, right? Like getting to sit down and interview an elder or someone who's experienced an event firsthand puts them in the center of constructing history in a way that very few other opportunities do. That this is a very unique experience. It also allows students to personalize historical narratives. They can put a face or a voice or a name with an event in a way that, reading the preamble to the Constitution or what have you just doesn't hit the same. It just doesn't hit the same. It also localizes historical events in a way that I find to be really powerful. And again, this is some of the motivation for my own work and my own research, because oftentimes, like even as a K-12 student, I didn't even learn that Black people really had like a past beyond like the 5 people that are named, in February. And so once I got to college and I took like an African-American history course, and I was like, oh, wow, like all these cool things happened. But I still wasn't really taught that like there was a civil rights movement in Waco, right? In like the real ordinary, regular place I'm from, right? And so if you can encourage students to consider that, there was a Great Depression that happened on this place and it affected Black people in this way, right? The Black Power movement, right, created, for example, the Waco Federation, right? And there were Black people here who helped organize a protest or sit-ins, right? When we incorporate oral history into our pedagogy, it allows students to see how people that they have existing relationships with, are close with, were participants in a history that shaped the place that they're living in. It wasn't just something, a big grand thing that happened over there in DC or Chicago or New York or Boston, LA. It was something that happened here. And I feel like that's really powerful. I think it would have transformed my experience as a K-12 student in my relationship to history early on. It also, and this is really, really important in the era of misinformation and disinformation that we're living in right now, getting students to engage with oral history helps them see that everything that's written down isn't correct. People misrecord details all of the time. An oral historian that I'm really fond of, his name is, he's passed on, but his name is Alexandro Portelli. And he has a whole book. And he was actually an Italian dude, a white guy, but he has a whole book about how specific details you would think you shouldn't get wrong, dates, like the date of a particular march or event, were misrecorded. But for oral history, right, he was able to retrace and really figure out, like, and point out the ways that what was written down was inaccurate. This has been the case, I can't tell you how many times in my current book project, focused on school desegregation, I'm literally going through and highlighting all the ways that what the news reporters are saying and all of these different groups is factually inaccurate, right? But if it wasn't for the oral histories that I had and the multiple oral histories that I had to compare it to, it would just be like, oh, they wrote it down, so it's right. When we walk students through, right, like, okay, we try to triangulate, we teach them to corroborate all of the sources, they are able to see and develop the skills to check and fact check and go back and see, right, is this a credible source or not? That is a skill that is doesn't get enough attention, but it's one that can serve them well in terms of evaluating historical information and contemporary information. And then, of course, all of this is encompassed within just promoting students' critical thinking skills, because ultimately that's our job as educators. So a few oral history collections that I like to underscore, and I won't be able to go through all of these. Hopefully folks can either record some of these or just be familiar with them. These are existing oral history collections that are accessible to anyone with internet access. And the ones on the left side of the screen, as noted by the title at the top, are Black specific. Now, I will say there are very few. This might be just about the extent of those available. Very few entire sources or collections that are dedicated to Black history specifically, oral Black histories. The StoryCorps, Stories to Celebrate Black History Month, that's the collection from which I shared the video at the beginning of the talk. Of course, oftentimes we are relegated to this 1 month in terms of resources, but we have to take advantage of what we get access to whenever it is and engage and continue to go back to that all year. But this second source here, the History Makers, this one is really, really, really cool. In part because it frames itself as the only oral history resource dedicated specifically to the African American experience after the WPA narratives. Now, the WPA narratives are that's the next one listed here. And these are probably familiar to a lot of people in the audience because this was part of an effort that came out of the Great Depression and the presidential administration trying to give people jobs. And it happened, I mean, the collection spanned in time over maybe a decade or so, but the intention was to record the oral histories, the memories, the living memories of folks who had been enslaved. And so that archive is accessible. And this was important because this is, 50, 60, 70 years after enslavement. And so these people were starting to pass away. And so it becomes a really important source for understanding the lived experience of enslaved people that, again, in most cases, they didn't have access to the written record. They weren't able to write these things down. Now, a lot of people, there's been a big debate about, how useful this information is, given that it was recorded decades after the people who were living experienced it. But again, if we go back to the intention and the interest of oral history, we're not consumed with, is that the most accurate detail, or they got this wrong or right? We are interested in how people remember what they went through and what that tells us about their relationship to the past and what the past meant to them. Okay, so all of these, you have to view them and take them into account through that lens. And then the Born in Slavery, the one at the very bottom, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, they're from the 1930s. That's actually one particular collection from the WPA narratives. But the History Makers collection, the second one on that list, that one is a really, really wonderful one, largely because not only does it include audio from African Americans, but they're also, most of them have video as well. So students will be able to view and hear a variety of Black history makers kind of speak about their firsthand experiences, at the March on Washington or what have you. The resources here on the right are more general. So oral history just quickly comes out of the interest of historians wanting to kind of move away from this great white man history, right? For a long time, the discipline of history was really dominated by like political leaders and a lot of, you know, old well-to-do white men who had quote unquote made history. There was a turn where folks started to say that they really were interested in more so trying to understand the experiences, what they call from below, of people, regular, average, everyday people. And so oral history is an effort to record some of those experiences that are more representative of most people. And so the Oral History Association, which is like a major association that kind of gives oral history guidance and kind of collects the different oral history collections that are available digitally. They have a list of some of the largest ones in the country. So they have a list there of about 20 different places you could go to find oral histories. But remember, these are not specific to the Black experience. So it would be important if you go to those to have keyword searches ready. Like you would need to make sure that you are, you know, if you're wanting your students to look up experiences of desegregation or you know, schooling in some cases, or, you know, experience with employment discrimination, right? You would need to have those keywords prepared. So it kind of curates a list of oral histories that are from a Black perspective that speak to particular topics that you all may be investigating as a class. So classroom activity ideas, and this is just a quick and dirty list. Like it's so much broader than this, and it's really limited only by your imagination. But some of the ways that, had I been as conversant in oral history as a classroom educator, I would have thought about having my students kind of compare or synthesize textbook accounts of particular points of history with an oral history transcript. So, you know, maybe you don't have time to prepare your students to go out and conduct an oral history and then transcribe it and then, you know, trying to integrate it into the historical record. But maybe there is enough time to give your students an oral history transcript and one that they can listen to and see how this firsthand perspective compares or contrasts or enriches what a textbook may say about a particular event. You could do the same thing with the local newspaper using a site like newspapers.com. You could look at how on a local level, a particular event is described, and then have the oral history interview sort of amplify what the the reporter or the writer of that article sort of characterizes about a particular event in their home locale or wherever you're studying. I think oral history is also a really wonderful way to facilitate or foster collaboration across subject areas. So pairing up with the ELA teacher, for instance, you know, maybe the students are reading a particular novel, with a historical kind of bend or flair, and you're able to kind of team up and select a few oral histories for students to engage with. And there might be some cross-curricular projects that you all could assign. And then this is like my dream project if I were to go back and teach, to create your own archive. Build your own archive as a class. And this would be something, you know, I would recommend keeping interviews pretty short just for the sake of transcription and whatnot. But this has been done before. McKinley High School is a high school out of Louisiana, I think Lafayette, if I'm not mistaken. And you all can access the oral history project and the ones that they collected here. But possibilities are endless. So I'm gonna speed through these last couple points, but just some considerations. Oral history is time intensive. If you were to conduct your own oral histories as a class, like original ones, it requires a lot of time, a lot of planning, and that's okay. That's fine, but that's just something to think about. If you are to collect your own original oral histories, remember, oral histories need to be accessible to the community. So you want to be intentional about how the community will have access to that knowledge. So think about dissemination. If it's a website or whatever, if you want to donate them to an existing archive, just have a plan for that. Equipment. If you want your students to engage not just with the transcripts, but be able to listen, you have to plan for things like headphones, right? Many students may have those, some may not. So these are just considerations. If students are going to conduct interviews with existing narrators, are these people in their family? Are these people from the community? What type of relationship does the student have with the people that they want to talk to? And if it's not an existing relationship, how do you train them to kind of build trust or credibility with those people? Or in some cases, is that even appropriate? You also would need to consider what interview questions students are prepared to go into the interview with. And if you intend to donate the interviews to an existing archive or use them beyond the purposes of an assignment, you have to get narrators to sign release forms. There are examples of these release forms across the internet, but that's just a consideration. And then last but not least, and probably most importantly, you want to encourage students to reflect on their experience of talking to somebody and learning from the past. That's going to be really, really essential, because it's an entire process that changes the interviewer and the narrator. So you want to encourage your students to consider and think through that. And then last, these are just a few implementation resources. If you are interested in actually trying to pursue an oral history project with your students, the Oral History Association has an entire handout for teachers in 412 contexts or classrooms. Berkeley Center for Oral History has resources that span, from kindergarten all the way up to the undergraduate level. Talking Gumbo here is actually it's a book, a PDF of a book online that sort of provides some guidance to folks who are trying to incorporate oral histories in their classroom. And then this last resource here is probably one of my favorites, Facing History and Ourselves. And they, on the website, they have a really thorough critical guide on how to facilitate the connection of the past to the present for students. Because ultimately, what we want to do with history broadly, oral history specifically, and oral history of the Black experience, even more specifically, is help students draw these links between the past and today and see how we're living in history. We are in the thralls of it. And history is central to anything that we know or think we know about Black people and our past and our present. So again, I know that's a lot of information. I'm happy to provide these resources in a handout. I can email it to LaGarrett and we can get it out. But that's what I have. So thank y'all. I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, so let's give Arcasia a hand. All right, for the information she brought. We got some snaps. We got some vibrant hand clapping there. We have some thank you so muches in the comments section here. All right, so much stuff going on here, so much information. We'll start it off with any questions. Montana, make sure you look through the chat to see if there's any questions from people there. But you can unmute and ask your questions.
Hey, I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's mine. Okay, cool. Hey, Dr. James-Gallaway, thank you so much for the presentation. I put this in here because it's kind of like three things. Oh, the chat is going off, but I had put them in there if you want to see it. So it was just like three brief things. I guess on the one hand, how are you distinguishing between oral history, and case study methodology and narrative inquiry, like other qualitative methodologies? What type of journal outlets are receptive to oral history methodology? And are you masking the identity of participants when you use oral history? So the distinguishing between them, where could you publish them, and do you mask identity? Sorry to throw three parts at you.
Sure. So this is a pretty academic, this is a pretty scholarly academic set of questions. So quickly, I would say I identify primarily in my research, I use historical methods, which aren't completely analogous to qualitative work. So the way that, and depending on the outlet or the journal, I don't have to say I'm doing a particular qualitative methodology. It's like I'm using historical methods, which is primarily the analysis of archival written records, and incorporating oral history interviews that informed, right, the way that I saw or shaped. You know, if you're writing for like a more qualitative audience or folks that aren't as historically inclined, you would have to say you're doing something else like case study methodology or narrative inquiry. But in my work, which pervasively uses oral history, I've never used any of those, and it hadn't been a problem. But again, I'm writing primarily to historical audiences and not as much to folks who would situate oral history as qualitative. Although it does, I argue that I do draw on some qualitative kind of orientations. One of the journals that I've published this work in is the Oral History Review, which is like the major journal for oral history research. I incorporated oral histories in a piece that I had in History of Education Quarterly. Again, these are more historical sites. I have a piece that drew on some oral history in race, ethnicity, and education. And that's actually the only journal, because oral history standard is that you don't anonymize. Oral history operates by a different set of practices and principles. So I would encourage you to get familiar with or like the literature around oral history, because the whole point of it is to know the history of the people that you have engaged with or that you're using transcripts of. And so to mask their identity is sort of counterintuitive, but in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, which is a more traditional social sciencey journal, I was made to anonymize the identity of folks, specifically to protect them, because there had been cases in the past where there were literally like death threats and attempts on people's lives because they were still living. And they said that racism existed, and some people don't agree with those statements. And so that, you know, so, but that's the only context in which I was made to change the identity of folks. So I hope that that is helpful.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Priscilla.
Hi, good morning. Thank
Good
you so
morning.
much for your presentation. I absolutely loved it. I am a fifth grade teacher. I am about to encounter the Revolutionary War with my fifth graders. They just finished up a Black History project where they had to choose an African-American that they thought was their icon and write about them, but not only write about them, but become them. So they had to choose a picture of the person, and then they had to make up themselves as that person and put their picture beside that. What I'd like them to do now, because we are studying American Revolution, a lot of people don't realize how important we were to that period. I want to know if there are any websites that you have given us that I can use to maybe put into my lessons a oral history of somebody who had a grandparent or a great grandparent, somebody that participated in the American Revolution. We hear about the Civil War, but we don't hear too much about the Revolutionary War, but there were Black participants in the Revolutionary War. We hear about Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre, but I want them to be able to see themselves in this fight. I want them to understand that it wasn't just the French, the British, you were in this. So can you give me some insight to that?
That's a wonderful, I appreciate that question, because that hits on something I wasn't able to underline as clearly as I would have liked to in my presentation. And kudos to you. I wish you had been my fifth grade teacher, but alas. So you're highlighting one of the, I won't call it a limitation, but one of the particular, like one of the kind of idiosyncrasies of oral history. In order to record oral history, folks have to be living. They have to be with us, which is why it's imperative. Like, we need to do this. Like, when I started my oral history, my project, my advisor, my dissertation advisor, I was like, well, do I need to wait to get approval, IRB approval? He's like, I mean, it'll be exempt, but no, like these people won't be with us. And, this was just a couple of years ago, and I've already had 3 of my narrators pass away. So this is of the essence. But when we think about something like the Revolutionary War, we're talking about the 18th century, and by and large, Black people, most Black people in this country did not have access to formal education, much less, the ability to be able to record from their own perspective. There are only so many Phyllis Wheatleys, right? Like they
Right.
did not have, generally, the ability to record their experiences as they were going through them.
Right.
And so the temporal kind of delicacies or sensitivities of oral history is what you're speaking to. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head that gets at the Black experience, like from like a Black voice, but I may encourage you to have your students kind of think, and this may be a collaboration you could, well, no, you're 5th grade. So maybe, I don't know how things are split up, but maybe you collaborate with the math teacher to look at sort of some demographic data about how many Black people were living in certain areas, and what can that tell us about their experiences day to day in the war, right? Like we can use numbers to try to highlight to try to humanize events in ways that ideally we would like to use oral history for, but it's just not available given the temporal kind of parameters that we're working in. I mean, I can think of like some books, like there's a wonderful scholar named Cabria Baumgartner who wrote a book called In Pursuit of Knowledge, and she looks at, it's not specifically about the Revolutionary War, but she is in sort of that same time era, and she's thinking about how Black women were going about trying to be educated in like New England, right? And so when we think about New England, we definitely don't think about like people, much less Black women trying to get an education. So I don't know, she may have a talk or something on YouTube that you could show your students and just try to get them to imagine what life would have been like for Black people, maybe not direct participants in the war, but living within a context of war, right? Because this is something that, when we're talking about the revolution, you're talking about folks in some cases being forced to fight because we're still, colonies or colonizing at that point.
Correct.
But there's also Black folks that were free, right? And so what was life? Just, I think imagining practices, Black feminists, abolitionists are trying to get us to cultivate imagining practices. And I think that this project in particular is a real opportunity to do that.
Okay.
I'm sorry I can't be more helpful, but.
No, that's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Ms. Greenwich, looks like there's several different resources that were put in the chat for you. It looks like more of kind of autobiography, journals and everything from people. Also, I wonder, I know Chantel is typically in here and stuff. I'm wondering about the Book of Negroes and the Canadian experience. Usually they're really good.
That's a good point.
With their journaling. And hey, Chantel, you have any information about the Black folk who went to Canada after the American Revolution? Maybe that can help as well. Just put in the chat for us as well. So I found their narratives are a little bit more expansive than US narratives concerning that because of their Black history.
Right.
Thank you.
Saba, is that right?
Saba.
Yes. Hi.
Hey.
Hello, Dr. James-Gallaway. What an honor to be with you this morning. I have 2 questions for you. My first question, so thank you so much for sharing, the pedagogical possibilities of oral history with our young people. One question is about what is your guidance in supporting them in constructing interview questions that will support them, like, especially if they don't know or have that relationship. It's not a family member. It's not somebody who they are directly linked to. And also just generally like the art of constructing good interview questions, right? So you can really get to what you need to get to in sort of a timely way too, right? The other question I have then, thinking about misknowledge, disinformation, and I come across this a lot, even when you have, you know, resources that are written from the perspectives of those you want, the voices you want to center, right? When you're listening or you're reading, you know, you're constructing your own misinformation because, or perpetuating your own violence because of the sort of the way dominant narratives and this violence lives within us, right? So how do you also guide, what guidance do you have for us on how do we guide our young people to listen? Like, how do we support them in listening to oral history projects in ways that are open and where they're really listening? You know, they're not judging, they're not, you know, so I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah,
for
no, those
your
are great
consideration.
questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. To your first question about interview protocol or questions. So two go-tos that my projects have taught me. One, I would construct questions as a class. So this would be like, I might dedicate like a week, definitely a couple of days to question construction. And this should be like a collaborative, iterative process. I would keep the list short, maybe 4 to 5 questions, maybe. Keep the questions very short and open-ended, as open as possible. Okay, you have a broad topic, an era that you want, you know, your narrator to speak to, but you know, what was your experience with, or no, like describe one of your best memories from elementary school. Who was your favorite teacher and why? Very short questions that get them to talk, because really what you want to do, especially with the first couple questions, is help them tap back into that time. You want to help bring them back to where they were, talk, and you want to engage senses. Can you remember what it smelled like? Can you remember what the weather was, right? You want to tap into those different parts of our knowing, what, again, many Eurocentric white folks may call discredited knowledge, but engaging some of those senses and really helping resituate your narrators back where they were is really what I found to be very helpful. And then to your second point about, I would say, like, in terms of like disrupting or getting students to be critical about the dominant narratives, I think, again, in the preparation work for conducting oral histories, we have got to name those mainstream narratives. We need to have a really critical conversation about generally what is assumed true about this event, and what are some, just get them to hypothesize, to predict what are some ways that, you know, talking to Black people may challenge what, you know, generally is understood to be true about this topic. So really naming those narratives, those mainstream dominant narratives, and then getting students to go into oral history interviews knowing that they're going to get a counter narrative that challenges these dominant ideas about what happened in the past. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much.
All right, Montana, do we have any questions in the chat?
Yeah, someone said, for the purpose of oral history project budget planning, what is a good range for stipends / honorariums to give to the people we interview?
That is a wonderful question. I really value people's time, Black people's time in particular, because so much of it has been stolen from us. So I would say shoot for the moon. I think Brittany Cooper has a piece on time, like a TED Talk or something on time. Like, time has been taken from us, and we are asking people to do labor, serious labor in remembering their past, because as much as we want to get them to reflect on positive experiences, a lot of the memories that you may be asking people to tap back into include a lot of violence. And going back to that place is labor. It is hard. So I would say, you know, if you're asking people maybe for a 30-minute interview, shoot for the stars. Like, ask for $50, $100, and maybe you get half of that. And make sure that your folks know when you are negotiating or when you are letting them know about the interview, what you're able to compensate, right? Make sure they know that on the front end. You want to be really transparent about, you know, what resources you have. But I mean, I'll try to compensate people as well as I can, because time is something they can't get back. You just can't. So I would say, start with about at least I would say about $50 for 30 minutes and really try to honor their time, be on time, have your equipment, have stuff ready to go. And when it's time to shut it down, you shut it down, or you have a conversation with them about, I'm willing to go for it if you can, but please understand that I really respect your time because I know this is a resource you can't get back.
Any other questions in the chat, Matena?
Yeah, someone just said, when we work with our youngest children, would it be a starting point to look at an event that occurred during their lifetime and interviewing those in their families, the starting point for building critical analysis and noticing skills? I just want to know your thoughts.
Absolutely. Typically, because I think one of the things that's missing from a lot of history pedagogy is that that personal connection piece. Often because we're studying things that happened before we were alive, we feel this disconnection. And so I think, definitely one of the ways working with some of our youngest, and often in many cases, some of our brightest, most critical students, I do think that looking at something that was more or less recent, something that they may have been able to hear somebody talk about or see on TV or see somewhere, could be a really good intro into sort of the practice and engagement of oral history. But hopefully that's just a starting point, because hopefully we're able to start there and go back and really help them develop a deeper sense and engagement with what is typically thought of as history.
All right, any other questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself and ask.
Oh, I see someone asked, providing questions ahead of time. Absolutely. If that's something, because sometimes narrators, depending on their age, technology may not be their forte, but if you're able to either text them or email them and give them questions ahead of time, that's completely appropriate, because in some cases it can lead to them being like, oh, I think I have a program from this thing up in my attic, and you'll be able to draw on other primary sources or other things from the time era, the era, that can speak to parts of history as well. So absolutely. Thank you.
I was just gonna say, does Ms. Fields have a question or comment? Yes, ma'am.
I know I've spoken a lot here, and I'm thinking that there are so many things that I have lived through at my age that I need to record, because as much as I'm educating children and have been and will continue to do to the day I die, they don't know the tragedy, the things that have been in my life, and I need to put that down. First off, as an artist, I have been drawing and doing things like that, but I need to put my own book out of me, and that is something we can present to a lot of older people, even though we are the educators. Help others in this journey also. So I will mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the other day I did a presentation to from high school age all the way up until people who were in their 70s and 80s, and we were talking about the Brown case, and listening to our elders talk about their experiences. I mean, and even to the day you could see their emotions, like we had people crying, right? Just from talking about their experiences 50 years ago, right? 50, 60 years ago. And so definitely in terms of oral histories, you definitely could bring people in the classroom so people can feel that history as well, which is really dynamic. It was a really powerful session there.
And to that point, actually, be open to folks that you intend to narrate declining invitations, or agreeing and then rescinding the offer, because my co-author, not who's on this call, Dr. Francina Turner, rewrote a piece in the Oral History Review about In my case, I was asking some folks to reflect on their experiences from school desegregation, and they agreed. They said they were excited, and it came time to the interview, and I was stood up. And, engaging with them later and finding out that they said they couldn't go back to that place. It had been too traumatizing. And again, that's why I say the compensation, this is labor. This is serious labor. And so, just being open and willing, like hopefully you have something planned, but it may not go through because, in some cases, like I said, it was roses and sunshine, but in many cases it wasn't. And so asking people to revisit that is challenging work and hard work. And it should be compensated to whatever extent is possible.
Ms. Harris, I see that you unmuted. Do you have a question? Oh, we can't hear you right now.
Ms. Harris, we're not able to hear your question. Can you unmute yourself or maybe turn up your volume? Because it looks like you're not muted, but we can't hear you. We're still not able to hear you. Or you may be able to type your question in the chat.
All right, so while she's typing her question in the chat, we have time for one more question, and then I definitely want to hear Ms. Harris's question.
I want to say thank you, first of all, amazing. Might I get your information from Dr. LeGarrette King for a presentation next year in Springfield, Missouri, whether you can come in person or over Zoom, I don't care. I'm excited because the oral histories, we've been blessed to have our elders from 80 to 97 that I'm working with.
Oh, wow.
And they are vibrant, and I do get stipends for them at $150 an interview. The interview does not go over an hour, and it is not under like 40 minutes. But also, we've got connected with an exhibit here, the Lincoln High School, where they actually had quotes that they had for their teachers. They remember everything. So this exhibit is going on, connected with them. And I'm really interested in the cross curriculum partnerships, like with the math, you talked about that. And that's what I'm working with. And it's just perfect. It's just a mirror reflection of what I really needed to hear today. So I'm really excited about you. And I just wanted to say that. And if I had a quick question, it would be, how long have you been in this, and what was your driver to make you start thinking about oral histories and the work that you do?
Oh, goodness, I could talk about that for a long time, but thank you so much. I receive everything that you're saying, and I really appreciate your encouragement and affirmation. I've been doing oral histories for upwards of officially maybe 5 or 6 years now. So not a terribly long time, but enough to know and recognize their value and how much of a disservice I feel like much of my K-12 education was for excluding them. That's been one of the things that's been made most clear for me. And I would say the impetus, I guess, for this work is just, again, trying to ask critical questions of my research that I saw the written record didn't reflect. And knowing, thinking back on those, holidays spent with my family when they were talking about this and knowing this, and then thinking about something as big as the Brown case or school desegregation, and thinking about what that would have looked like for the people I call my family in the place I call home, and really wanting to localize and personalize it in a way that I felt like was relatable to most people, because I think most people don't live in New York or LA or Chicago or even Houston, right? Like most people live in smaller, less remarkable places where history still happened and it's still really important. So I hope that answers your question.
Um,
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Contact information for those who would like to contact you.
Oh, email is great. I'll put it in the chat. Yeah, email is wonderful.
And Ms. Harris, have you typed in your question yet, or? Man, I really wanted to hear your question. I'm sorry. If you could email.
Can I say something? She said she used to work for StoryCorps, and I'm waiting to hear from her. And I'm so sorry she can't speak.
Oh, wow.
She has a lot to tell.
That's a
Oh,
wonderful resource.
I'll mute myself.
Oh shoot! Oh man, I really would like to do hear that. Ms. Harris, what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna put my information here. So if you could email me, I could possibly pass that along, or next session we can definitely connect that question.
And can I say, if she goes down to her mute, clicks it, and just touches her mic, it'll usually pop back on.
All right, try that. Touch your mute and.
There's a question here in the chat from Ms. Lee asking about where they might deposit their oral histories. I'm not familiar with the university, but the University of Buffalo may have talked to the librarian or someone in library services, an archivist there. So check the local campus university library, and then the local, the city library. And either of those, if they don't have the infrastructure to house the oral histories, go to the state level and contact someone for the state of New York, and they should be able to guide you to effectively preserve those really valuable resources.
All right, good people. Y'all know Black History Nerds is just for 1 hour, and y'all trying to make it into a Black History Nerds colloquium, right? So let's we will see you all on next week again. I am so appreciative of you all taking time out of your Saturday mornings to come learn with and from us, and I really appreciate you all. Make sure you all sign up, and here's the thing: invite somebody, invite a friend over, right? And let's build this thing from the ground up. I appreciate you all. Let's give Dr. James-Gallaway another hand for a wonderful presentation. It seems like all these people are bigging you up in the chat. They have all these questions. So when I send the video out, you'll have the chat transcript and can read over it and everything like that. So everyone, have a lovely Saturday, and we will see you next week. We got a few more comments in there. I like to give people some time to put their stuff in the chat so we can have that as a record. Yeah, you never know. Like 100 years from now, some whippersnapper may do a research on the Black History Nerds. You never know. So they need all this stuff. Need all the chats.
Miss Akua is also in my 521.
Oh, she is.
I can talk to her on Wednesday too.
Great, great,
She
great.
has so many good stories.
She does.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. So we definitely gonna. Christine, you telling me I have to be somewhere next year, because you know what I'm saying, we hadn't even talked about that.
I know, right? I'm just so excited because this is all just depositing right in the right places. I got a question for you, Dr. King.
Hold
How
on.
are we going to?
Let me start